Hello everyone and welcome back to Lady Disdain Reads. My name is Beatrice and today I'm going to be talking to you about Jane Austen, theatre and religious feeling. This is actually my rehearsal practice for a paper I'm going to be presenting later today at my university symposium. So I have my notes here and I'm going to use this video as an opportunity not only to talk to you but also to rehearse what I'm going to say to other PhD students in my program here at Notre Dame. So, as I said, my paper that I'll present today is about theatre, theatricality, and the idea of religious feeling. So let me give you a little bit of background on the scholarship on this first, and then I'll get to my ideas on this. Jane Austen's relationship to the theatre has long been the subject of academic debate. Broadly speaking, Austen scholars tend to fall into one of two camps: the anti-theatrical/moralist Austen, and the theatrical/subversive Austen. In the first camp, we find slightly older, though still very valuable scholarship. Austen critics like C.S. Lewis and A.C. Bradley are very helpful in their discussion of the moral dimension of Austen's novels, but they tend to entirely disregard the direct influence of theatre on Austen and the importance of categories such as theatricality and performance within her novels. Later in the 20th century, in her seminal work Jane Austen and the War of Ideas, Marilyn Butler acknowledges Austen's interest in the theatre, but argues for an anti-theatrical Austen ultimately, linking Austen's wariness of theatricality in Mansfield Park to her increasing evangelical leanings by the end of her life. In the other camp, so the theatrical/subversive Austen, we find critics who acknowledge Austen's fascination with Romantic era theatre, like Claudia Johnson, though not all the time these critics are interested in actually teasing out the implications of Austen's interest in the theatre within her novels. In fact, the issue of how Austen's attitudes towards the theatre are ideologically manifested within her novels remains a relatively underdeveloped area in Romantic studies. Some valuable approaches can be found in the criticism of the likes of Penny Gay, Paula Byrne, Peter Knox-Shaw, and forgive my pronunciation because I don't know how to pronounce this critic's surname, but Nora Nachumi, I believe. Byrne does an excellent job of showing, for example, the theatrical techniques and tropes that were brilliantly incorporated by Austen into her own novels. Gay, Knox-Shaw, and Nachumi present Austen as having a complex attitude towards theatricality and performance. They emphasize a tension between Jane Austen's clear interest in the release of feelings allowed by both theatrical and social performance, and her deep-seated suspicion of extreme, potentially insincere displays of emotion. In particular, Penny Gay associates the fear of theatricality within Austen's disapproval of radical Jacobin ideas from France, while Knox-Shaw suggests that Mansfield Park's anti-theatricality dramatizes Fanny Price's evangelical tendencies, but that this does not necessarily mean that Austen herself is invested in this evangelical aversion to theatre. And I slightly disagree with Knox-Shaw here, but I'll tell you more about it in a minute. So despite the wealth of recent scholarship on Austen and the theatre, Austen's relationship with theatricality is almost inevitably presented as a negative one or as a positive one, but that comes from her wanting to be subversive. So that there tends to be that binary. Instead, what I want to do is to present a more positive, constructive relationship between Austen's moralistic evangelical leanings and her love of theatre. And first of all, we have to establish the influence of evangelicalism on Austen to be able to prove this. So, on the side of the love of the theatre, it's well documented that Austen and her family patronized theatres throughout her life, so there is not much argument there. We know that she loved the theatre. On the side of proving the influence of evangelicalism on her, we actually know that Clapham Sect Evangelical writers contemporary to Austen influenced her. So William Wilberforce is the most notable one because obviously he is associated with the abolition of slavery in Britain, but we do not know whether she read him. She would have almost inevitably been aware of him because he was extremely well known, but we have no hard proof that she read any of his works. But a lot of his close friends or people in his kind of abolitionist circles, we do know that Austen read those people. For example, Thomas Clarkson and Thomas Gisborne. We know that she enjoyed reading both of them and their works. And all of these evangelical writers who were involved with the abolition of slavery at the time were also distrustful of the theatre, both as a locus of the immorality and of theatre as the idea of the performance of the self, as being insincere. So what I want to show is that these same evangelical writers, yes, they were averse to theatre going, but they were also very positive about genuine displays of emotion, especially when that emotion was religious feeling. Once we look at the private theatricals of Mansfield Park in light of these contemporary debates, I think it becomes apparent that the novel is neither subversively theatrical nor moralistically anti-theatrical, but rather actually uses the theatre debate of the late 1700s and the early 1800s to distinguish between genuine feeling, especially religious feeling, and social performance. So I also want to give you a quick overview today of how theatrical displays of sentiment, religious sentiment particularly, are used in two other novels by Austen. So it's not just Mansfield Park, but it's also two other novels that are infused with evangelical sensibilities. And those two other novels are Sense and Sensibility and Persuasion. Let's start with a quick overview of evangelicalism itself. Evangelicalism combined two attitudes that, while superficially in conflict with each other, actually reveal the main focus of the movement. On the one hand, a condemnation of both the theatre itself and performance more broadly as insincere and immoral, and the promotion of theatrical displays of religious feeling on the other hand. In 1797, William Wilberforce published what would become one of the seminal texts for Anglican evangelicals, the rather clunkily named A Practical View of the Prevailing Religious System of Professed Christians in the Higher and Middle Classes, contrasted with real Christianity. His aim was not to antagonize the Church of England, but rather to bring reform to the hearts of especially middle-class Anglicans, whom he thought were Christian in name, but not in practice. Wilberforce is now best known for the success of his abolitionist efforts, but one aspect that actually struck his readers at the time was his censorious attitudes towards theatres, which he described as the place where decorum and modesty and regularity retire, where riot and lewdness are invited to the spot, where the sacred name of God is often profaned. So, where sentiments are often heard with delight and motions and gestures often applauded, which would not be tolerated in private company. That's the end of the quotation. If one must go to the theatre, Wilberforce seems to be arguing, it should be done so with cautiousness or caution. And he adds that people should only go to the theatre with a double portion of watchfulness and seriousness of mind, basically never letting go of one's guard. For Wilberforce, then, the concern with theatre is twofold. Firstly, he is concerned for those who practice it as a profession because he thinks that theatres are a hotbed of immorality, especially of sexual licentiousness. And secondly, he is concerned that sentiments are displayed on the stage which one would not dream of exhibiting in real life. Another key evangelical text that also deals with dramatic performance is the equally popular Inquiry into the Duties of the Female Sex by Thomas Gisborne. It is likely that Austen would have been familiar with Wilberforce, as I said, but we actually know that she was definitely familiar with Gisborne because we know that she read and enjoyed this particular work in 1805, and we know this from Austen's letters. Gisborne comes to the condemnation of the theatre from a different angle compared to Wilberforce. He focuses specifically on private theatricals, so that's very relevant for us when we think about Mansfield Park, making his work highly pertinent, in fact, to our understanding of Mansfield Park. He argues that theatricals destroy diffidence by the unrestrained familiarity with persons of the other sex, which inevitably results from being joined with them in the drama. So that is exactly what Sir Thomas in Mansfield Park is concerned about. That's why he stops the theatricals. So we have a kind of Thomas Gisborne figure in Sir Thomas in Mansfield Park. Knowing that Austen read these exact words by Gisborne just a few years before writing Mansfield Park problematizes, I think, any readings of the novel Mansfield Park that would paint Austen as someone who satirizes Sir Thomas kind of unconditionally, or someone who is completely kind of parodying or mocking Sir Thomas's evangelical condemnation of his children's theatricals. Austen, I don't think, entirely shared these evangelical concerns, and she definitely does not depict Sir Thomas as a straightforwardly positive character either, far from that. But she certainly does seem to be wary of the ways in which theatrical performance, especially private theatricals, can be misused to one's moral detriment. And yet, on the other hand, evangelicalism was also deeply positive of sincere displays of religious sentiment. As aforementioned, the concept of enthusiasm is extremely important to the evangelical movement. Prior to the 18th century, it was almost an exclusively negative term, almost exclusively used derogatorily. Emotional displays were associated with the excesses and horrors of the French Revolution, so this is hardly surprising. In A Practical View, Wilberforce devotes a whole section, however, of his third chapter to the issue of enthusiasm, of religious feeling, of the passions. And he argues for the importance of the passions in one's spiritual life, saying this: "The passion, which alone the Holy Scriptures dignify with the name of love, is a deep, not a superficial feeling, a fixed and permanent, not an occasional emotion." And enthusiasm was equally important for other prominent members of the Clapham Sect, for example, for Thomas Clarkson, who again we know Jane Austen read. Clarkson uses the word enthusiasm repeatedly when encouraging his readers to join the cause for the abolition of slavery, in his also very clunkily named The History of the Rise, Progress and Accomplishment of the Abolition of the African Slave Trade by the British Parliament from 1808. Here we have further proof of Austen's familiarity with and sympathy for the Clapham Sect. Clarkson is mentioned by Austen in her letters as an author she was in love with in January 1813 when writing to her sister Cassandra. And this is crucially right in the middle of the composition of Mansfield Park. That's very important, and I like to think that that's not a coincidence. Sure enough, the word enthusiasm pops up in those novels which are the most evangelical in spirit several times, and those same novels were also most concerned with the displays of religious feeling. The word enthusiasm is absent from all of the minor and unfinished works, as well as from Northanger Abbey, Pride and Prejudice, and Emma. But the words enthusiasm or enthusiast appear 4 times in each of the following: Sense and Sensibility, Mansfield Park, Persuasion. What is even more fascinating is that those exact terms are reserved for either the heroine in moments of genuine, often religious feeling, so Marianne, Fanny, Anne, or for characters who are clearly being disingenuous and or are showing an exaggerated display of emotion. For example, John Dashwood in Sense and Sensibility, Maria Bertram, Mansfield Park, or Louisa Musgrove in Persuasion. The double application of the word enthusiasm suggests that Austen is drawing her readers' attention to what is a crucial point and a major concern for her: that dramatic releases of emotion always hover between deceitful and morally corruptive, and sincere and spiritually restorative. And we have to make that choice of whether a character is showing sincere feeling or a kind of theatrical, insincere display of emotion. Now, in an ideal world, I would have another hour and a half to tell you all about Mansfield Park and instances of debates about the theatre within Mansfield Park, the influence of Elizabeth Inchbald's Lover's Vows in Mansfield Park, but I just don't have the time right now. So what I'm going to do instead, because I don't have the time to do that justice, is I'm just going to give you my main point about Mansfield Park that I want you to take away, which is that I think the heroine, Fanny Price, represents the model kind of William Wilberforce moderate evangelical, who doesn't necessarily outright condemn the private theatricals, but who is very suspicious of them. And then on the other hand, we have someone like Sir Thomas Bertram, who's the more kind of Calvinist killjoy version of evangelicalism, and completely shuts down the performance of his children, of Inchbald's play Lover's Vows. And I think that Jane Austen is the more Wilberforcean / Fanny Price type of evangelical in her sensibilities here, rather than being like a Sir Thomas-like killjoy. I think she approves of the theatre, but I think she's also very suspicious of it, especially when putting on a performance actually allows people to also put on a kind of social performance and to kind of lie to other people about their real feelings through the guise of performing in a play. Now, I want to talk to you a little bit more about the question of religious feeling and religious feeling as theatre, as display, before finishing up my paper for today. So far, we have seen that evangelicalism is not always opposed to emotion, and that Austen herself uses the language, techniques, or context of theatrical performance to allow her characters to uncover their true feelings. One question remains, and that is the question of whether it is possible for specifically religious feeling, the kind of which evangelicals like Wilberforce and Clarkson would have approved, to be expressed through theatrical means. So can religious feeling beat theatrical, basically, is my question. In Austen's novels, I believe this to be entirely possible, and I will demonstrate this by analysing the use of the word enthusiasm, so crucial to the evangelical movement, in Austen's own works. Many of the scholars whom I have already mentioned recognize the importance of the concept of enthusiasm for evangelicalism, but argue that enthusiasm is precisely what Austen cannot approve of, often citing the example of her dislike for the sermons of her evangelical cousin, Reverend Edward Cooper, who apparently was a very boring, very conceited man, and whom apparently she disliked intensely. And often scholars will point out that the Austens as a family were more traditional Anglicans, and they might have been skeptical of the evangelical movement. What I want to argue instead is that Austen does something absolutely fascinating with the idea of enthusiasm. She links it to her concern regarding the distinction between performed and real emotion, and thus attributes it as a quality both to very disingenuous and to very sincere characters, leaving the reader to determine which is which. So let's look at some examples for clarity. I'll try to have one example from each novel. In Mansfield Park, in Volume 1 of Mansfield Park, we find a description of Fanny Price and Edmund Bertram gazing at the stars. The usually reticent Fanny indulges in a lyrical eulogy on the beauty of the unclouded night and the woods. And this is Fanny's eulogy that I'm about to read to you. Here's harmony. Here's repose. Here's what may leave all painting and all music behind, and what poetry can only attempt to describe. Here's what may tranquilize every care and lift the heart to rapture. When I look out on such a night as this, I feel as if there could neither be wickedness nor sorrow in the world, and there certainly would be less of both if the sublimity of nature were more attended to, and people were carried more out of themselves by contemplating such a scene. In this beautifully romantic passage, romantic with a capital R, Fanny is both a spectator to nature and a spectacle herself. She dramatizes her love of nature in a way that makes her seem much more animated than what many otherwise insightful critics of Austen actually give her credit for. Just at this moment, Edmund comments on how wonderful it is to hear Fanny's enthusiasm for nature. Although the same word is used twice more to describe Fanny's release of emotions, this is perhaps the most obvious example of how, when connected to a reverential, sincere, dramatic expression of feeling, enthusiasm is not an untoward sentiment for Austen within her novels. This pattern of enthusiasm being ascribed to both sincere and insincere characters, always lingering in this liminal space between theatricality as release of emotion on the one hand and as deception on the other, extends to both Sense and Sensibility and Persuasion. And just as a quick reminder, because I didn't mention this, in Mansfield Park, the other example of the word enthusiasm is with Mary, who, of course, we know to be a very insincere character, and so she expresses a kind of false enthusiasm, which is contrasted with Fanny's real enthusiasm. So let's look at Persuasion first for the other two novels. In Persuasion, the word enthusiasm was once used to talk about Louisa Musgrove, as she describes to Captain Wentworth how she would behave if she were married to a man in the Navy. But we know that Louisa is a stubborn character, and so we can assume that her enthusiasm is of the misguided and immature kind, the kind that Marianne exhibits herself in the beginning of Sense and Sensibility. When she becomes engaged to Captain Benwick, we are told she quickly transitions from being an enthusiast for the Navy to an enthusiast for Scott and Lord Byron. Her enthusiasm is, if not exactly deceptive, shallow and fleeting at the least. Then, in the middle of the novel, before Anne learns of his true character, Mr. Elliot is positively contrasted with characters of fancied enthusiasm, by whom we can take to mean the likes of Louisa Musgrove. But this lack of enthusiasm also becomes unsalutary once we know that Mr. Elliot's coolness in fact conceals his lack of morals. It is Austen herself, of course, here who is trying to tell us that lack of enthusiasm is bad, but also an excessive and kind of performative enthusiasm is also bad. The right kind of enthusiasm is exhibited by none other than the heroine, Anne Elliot herself, who, like Fanny Price in Mansfield Park, shows the right and moral kind of enthusiasm. The narrator tells us that she prefers Captain Wentworth to Mr. Elliot, partly because, and this is my favourite quotation, I think, from Persuasion, warmth and enthusiasm did captivate her still. Like Fanny Price's, her enthusiasm assumes religious overtones. At the end of the novel, the narrator describes Anne's reflections on her reunification with Captain Wentworth as follows. Prettier musings of high-wrought love and eternal constancy could never have passed along the streets of Bath than Anne was sporting with from Camden Place to Westgate Buildings. It was almost enough to spread purification and perfume all the way. Her enthusiastic love for Wentworth does not quite amount to an expressly religious sentiment, but it is so unadulterated and so sincere that it almost purifies the whole of Bath. In a novel in which the reunion of Anne and Wentworth is often attributed to the works of Providence, this is mentioned 3 times in the novel, Anne's enthusiasm assumes the tone of exactly the kind of regulated enthusiasm that Clapham Sect Evangelicals writers would have considered beneficial to one's spiritual life. And finally, twice in Sense and Sensibility, insincere characters are ironically described as being enthusiastic, Lady Middleton and John Dashwood. But, predictably, enthusiasm is most often associated with Marianne. At the beginning of the novel, we are told that Mr. Willoughby, by agreeing with Marianne in matters of books and art, called to all of her enthusiasm. While when speaking to Colonel Brandon a little later, Eleanor laments that Marianne's charms of enthusiasm cannot redress her ignorance of the world. One may be left with the impression that Marianne's enthusiasm is exaggerated, performative, and in need of correction, were it not for the fact that at the very end of the novel we have a scene that I think corrects this. We are not meant to take Eleanor's words at their value. Certainly, Eleanor believes that her enthusiasm is overly exaggerated and performative, but we do not have to agree with her as readers. After all, her own strategy of repressing emotion and suppressing information from her own family is hardly more salutary than Marianne's excessive enthusiasm. Marianne's enthusiasm doubtlessly is misguided, but not inherently evil. That's the crucial point. Even after her resolution to embark on a serious course of studies and learn to control her emotions at the end of the novel, she hardly abandons the pleasures of displaying passionate feelings for the benefit of her sister. The difference is that now, having morally grown from bitter disappointment with Willoughby, she has redirected her enthusiasm. Reflecting on her relationship with Willoughby, she concludes as follows. My illness, I knew well, had been entirely brought on by myself, by such negligence of my own health as I felt even at the time to be wrong. Had I died, it would have been self-destruction. I wonder at my recovery, wonder at the very eagerness of my desire to live, to have time to atonement for my God, and to you all, did not kill me at once. While Marianne does not quite describe it as such, her eagerness to live amounts to a newfound religious enthusiasm. She is highly theatrical in her unburdening of her feelings to Eleanor, but this time she is using her enthusiastic nature as an evangelical like Wilberforce or Clarkson would do and would approve of. That is, she's using it to express her love of God and to ask for atonement. Notice that she says, my God, not just God, another hint that her Christianity takes on a personal, devotional, evangelical tinge. Religious feeling, though it is always performative in the sense that it is exhibited for the benefit of others, is completely acceptable here. Similarly to Edmund's discussion in Mansfield Park of how preaching is a kind of good performance that one accepts permanently. Marion's newfound religious enthusiasm and fervour is finally, though still dramatic, entirely sincere. I want to conclude by just returning quickly to the Wilberforcean idea of a double portion of watchfulness, with which I began my discussion of theatricality. Although, as we have seen, Austen was an avid theatre-goer, I suggest that by the end of her life, evangelical suspicions of the theatre influenced Austen enough to prompt her to dramatise such tensions in the evangelical character of Fanny Price in Mansfield Park. However, what I believe Austen achieves is actually a kind of compromise rather than a complete change of heart. And thus in Mansfield Park we find a novel that is wary of social performance, extremely suspicious of it in fact, but never fully condemns theatrical performance in itself. Far from posing an obstacle then to Austen's shifting religious persuasions, were in a creative relationship with her love of theatre in fact. Understanding her cautious admiration of evangelical writers thus provides the key to our understanding of her deep suspicion of social performance on the one hand, but also her joyful love of theatricality on the other. Thank you so much for allowing me to practice that. I think I might have to cut it down a bit, in fact. That was a bit too long, but I very much enjoyed giving you a presentation of some of my thoughts on Jane Austen at the theatre. I really hope this will turn into a journal paper soon, in the next few months, and thank you for listening to such a long video. So the next few videos I will make on this channel are all going to be guest videos. So we are going to start with one of my good friends from Oxford and then move on to other academics that I think have valuable insights on anything to do with teaching and studying literature at an academic, at a kind of university level, and faith and religion, and how we can talk about those things together in a way that is kind of productive and rather than antagonistic. So I hope you enjoyed this video, and I will see you hopefully in the next couple of weeks with a new video that is going to be about hopefully medieval literature and Christianity and faith. Thank you so much for watching, and see you then. Bye!